Hi, this is Pat Sauer, Executive Director of the Iowa Stormwater Education Partnership, and we are here in Ada Hayden Park to take a look at some of the areas in the park. Joining me is
Tom Rosburg from Drake University.
And Joshua Thompson with the City of Ames Parks and Recreation Department.
Okay, here we go. We're going to start our journey.
Well, good morning. As Pat Sauer said, we're out here at Ada Hayden Heritage Park, one of our 38 parks here at the City of Ames. We're actually at the south end of Ada Hayden Lake, and what we're here is a 3.5 acre plot of land that has been designated as an oak savanna restoration. We started this project back in 2015. We brought in the Conservation Corps, heavily infested with honeysuckle, buckthorn, and other non-native noxious weeds. They came in, we took out truckloads and truckloads, treated the stumps of those species, and continued restoration up until now. And during those times, we brought in some goats. We've done some grazing on this property. We're still waiting to find the conducive conditions to burn, but that's our goal, to get it burned yet this fall. But as you can see, there's a lot of mature oak species, but there's also some other hardwoods or other basswoods in this that need to probably be removed. But so this is a continual effort. Like I said, we've been started in 2015 and continue to work on it. The reason why this was designated as an oak savanna is obviously predominantly the species on this hillside are oaks. The Friends of Ada Hayden Heritage Park, a friends group that's very active in the management of this park, developed a management plan, and they took every area of the park and dissected it into different sections. And this section they designated as an oak savanna. So we're using cultural methods and some chemical methods to try to treat this area to try to make sure to restore it back to its original habitat.
Can you tell us about any challenges with having the goats here and maybe movement or introduction of other species that may have occurred?
Yeah, no, the goats were brought in to kind of a natural cultural method to remove some of the non-native species. But one of the things that happened was specifically burdock. Burdock became a huge problem because they wouldn't eat the burdock, and the seeds were sticking to their fur and were spreading throughout this area. So we did the goats for a couple sessions and realized they were doing some good. They did knock it back, knock some of the non-native species back, but they also did create some other issues for us, which we had to take care of later.
Well, yeah, I really want to commend Josh and the City of Ames for taking on this project, because savanna restoration is really important. You know, it's really hard to find anything in Iowa yet that remotely resembles what a really true savanna was like on the native landscape. And you know, Josh is right. I mean, we have the evidence of a savanna here in the oaks. When you can see these large, formally spreading, you can see in some cases they've lost the lower limbs, but I bet if you looked at a 1930 aerial photo, and maybe we can do that for the webinar, look at a 1930 aerial photo for this area, we would see just a scattering of large trees on this north-facing slope. North-facing slopes were common places for a savanna on the native landscape because of the reduction in fire intensity as fire burned across the prairie and burned downslope. The intensity of the fire would decrease, the flames would become less high, less intense, the fire would become more patchy because of more moist fuel conditions and less light, cooler type of environment. The heat from the fire is going behind the fire rather than in front of the fire as fire burns its way downhill. So you can see this across the Iowa landscape in many places. North and northeast facing slopes especially are places where we see these really large oaks. And so no doubt there was a savanna here, and to bring a savanna back, you really have to have the trees. And so the trees are here. You can't replace these trees, unless you got like 200 years or so. So you got to have the trees, but the herbaceous layer is completely gone, of course. What used to be a savanna, because of the encroachment of woody vegetation, other tree species, and then of course the honeysuckle that Josh was talking about, the understory is completely changed. So that's the challenge now, of course, opening this up. And they've got a good start by taking out the honeysuckle. That is a tremendous job right there. Many of you probably have seen places where honeysuckle is just like a wall. And so that's an important job, and making, of course, sure that honeysuckle is not coming back. And so continuing to work on any honeysuckle coming up from the seed bank. But now, again, the reed canary grass and other plants we're going to be seeing here, are not indicative of a savanna. They need to be more prairie-like. So first of all, we need more light. We've got to start by getting the honeysuckle out, but now many of these larger trees need to come out. There's box elders, there's basswoods, there's elms, there's green ash, whole number of variety of tree species, again, would not have been on a savanna. If you truly want to say you're doing a savanna restoration project, then those species really need to come out. There's a black cherry right there, for example, another black cherry there. So I know that can be kind of hard, taking out those large trees. You got to do something with them. A lot of times the public doesn't like to see trees come out, but if you're going to be committed to savanna restoration, then you really need to be thinking about opening up the canopy to what my definition of a savanna is, and this will vary among ecologists, but my definition of a savanna is going to be anywhere from 10 to about 35% canopy cover. So if we're looking down on top of it from a bird's eye view, the canopy trees are only occupying no more than 1/3, basically, of the land area. And if we were to look at this now from the top down, I mean, it's probably easily 60%, 70%. So there's quite a few trees that need to come out, and in fact, probably even some oak trees. And that, again, could be hard, but I can see a cluster of 5 oaks right up there close together, probably taking 1 or 2 of those out. Because if you really want to get young oaks like these right here in front of us to continue to grow and develop to replace the larger oaks 100 years down the road or so, they're going to need to have more light and more room. So, and by opening it up to that canopy cover of 10 to 35%, you are really opening it up to, again, being more like a prairie. And that, of course, is the type of vegetation that we want to see in here, more of those prairie plants, those light-loving plants. So to me, that's the goal. It takes a while to get there, but you got to start by getting rid of the honeysuckle, and that's a good start.
Tom, where are we headed next?
We're going to walk up this slope a little bit and just see what we can see for plants up in there. All right, now we're just looking at a bunch of reed canary grass for the most part down here in the lower slope. There are some native sedges here. These sedges along the edge here are cone sedge, which is really more a sedge meadow species. So they may be indicative of sort of what used to be here at the bottom of this slope would have been maybe a sedge meadow coming out into here. Of course, this has all changed with the quarry and the lake now. But yeah, let's take a walk up. We'll start again up the slope here a ways and see what kind of plants we can find.
Some of the challenges that we encounter as public property abuts private property is individuals or homeowners encroaching on the parkland. When this property was developed, this whole Ada Hayden was developed, there was a conservation easement that was set up for lands directly to the south of Ada Hayden. Individuals that had a large area of oak species and was included in the easement, and the easement basically prohibits individuals from doing any type of cutting, trimming, or mowing, those types of typical management practices that you'd see on private property without written permission from the city of Ames. And typically we have not given a ton of information or a ton of permission to do that unless a tree was become a risk tree or a hazard type of situation. As I come out here and have multiple conversations with these homeowners, some of them are compliant, some of them are not compliant. And so it's continually working with these homeowners that they understand the stipulations that are set out in the easement, but also education of why we're doing what we're doing, the benefits of the species that we have here, the benefits of the land here, and trying to keep it natural the way it was, but also manage it effectively. So those are things that we deal with. It's a constant battle. Most of the time when you educate these individuals, they really, really appreciate it. But sometimes it continues to be reinforced.
Let's take a look at some of the herbaceous species we have here. We're in a pretty dense cover here. I would say it's at least 75, 80% canopy cover right here. So really more of a forest right here. But the herbaceous layer is pretty open. So here again, the removal of the honeysuckle has been effective. There's a few burdock plants still present in places. Josh talked about that and the challenges they had there with the goats. There are some honeysuckle plants, not right here, but a little bit further away. And so there's always going to be a continued need, of course, to watch for those invasive species. They've done a good job of clearing them out here, but they will come back if you're not vigilant and keep on top of it. So the native species that we have right in front of me down here, first of all, let's look at the sedge, this grass-like plant that we see growing all through here. This is Pennsylvania sedge. My clue to that is just the amount that we're seeing here, a large patch of it. Pennsylvania sedge often grows in these large patches. If you pull up a little bit of the plant, you have to get right down to the base. You see this reddishness at the base of the stems here. That is a good characteristic for Penn sedge as well. And they're just a really fine leaves. This is great because this is a great fuel to carry fires then through the forest or the savanna. You need to have these grass-like plants, sedges or grasses, to provide that fine fuel load to be able to support a fire. Some other things that we see here quite abundantly are this plant right here. There's lots of stems here, so I'll just pull one up here. So this one, looking at the shape of the leaves, the pretty acuminate tips out here, this is starry Solomon seal. So starry Solomon seal is Myanthemum stellatum. It's more related to false Solomon seal than it is to Solomon seal. I think this is a pretty good example again of a plant that would have been found in open woodlands or savannas on a native landscape. There's a pretty good colony of it growing here. Another one that I think is somewhat indicative of a more open woodland or savanna is this one right here. This is red columbine. And then the other things we're seeing here, the white snake root. That's this one up here. And I saw some white avens. That's this one right here with the flower, white flowers right here in front of us. Those are more forest species, so again, more shaded environments. So I think, what one needs to think about or keep their options open is, even though this probably was a savanna, again, we can look at soils to see what the soils say. Soils would be like a transitional soil between a prairie and a forest. Soil scientists map transitional soils and name them separate names. And so a transitional soil is this idea of a soil that has some characteristics that indicate more of a prairie-like environment, but also has some characteristics indicate more of a forest environment. It has the beginning of an E horizon, for example. So those transitional soils are considered to be probably soils that formed under a savanna or maybe an open woodland. So again, in this gradient from prairie to forest, as trees increase in occurrence on the landscape and get more common, density goes up, canopy cover goes up. From 0 to 10% is prairie or grassland. There can be a few trees and we can still call it a prairie. From 10 to 35 is savanna, as I described. From 35% to 65% canopy cover is woodland. And so an open woodland would be, as a savanna is becoming more encroached by trees and filling in a little bit more, it's going to transition to that. An open woodland basically is from 35 to 50%. A woodland, again, is this ecosystem that straddles 50%. Goes again from 35 to 65. Once you get above 65% canopy cover, then we call that a forest. So I think, again, in Iowa's native landscape, we had primarily woodlands, except in the most deep ravines and deepest valleys, the most fire protected parts of the landscape. That's where we would have had some forest. But for the most part, our wooded systems were woodlands. And I think it's important, to distinguish a woodland from a forest then. Woodlands means that again, there is a more of an open nature to it. There's more light, and it's again this system that would straddle 50% canopy cover. So if a savanna restoration, getting down to 10 to 35% canopy cover is just too difficult in terms of the amount of energy, the cost, because here again, we're talking taking out quite a few more trees. And again, lots of these trees could come out. The basswoods here around us are all young. They're probably, certainly, not much older than 20 or 30 years old. So there's trees that can come out. But again, I think maybe, you might not have to take very many oaks out, but a few oaks out to get down to at least 35%. But if that again is too difficult and too much of a transition and just too much of a cost, then shoot for a woodland. Go from what was a forest or still is a forest, to a woodland. And an open woodland would be the closest thing to a savanna. And that would provide again more of an environment that would at least invite some of those prairie species that would have been here.
Now we're on the other side of the oak savanna woodland area, on the lake bank side, and to talk about a couple things that how it was constructed, why it was constructed. So the whole point of it was to be able to see the lake, and it was constructed with and planted with native prairie species. But one of the things that's our issue is we've got some sandbar willow, we've got box elder, a lot of non-native species that have become challenges for us to try to manage. Individuals, like I said, like to want to walk on or ride on the path and see the lake, and we're continually fighting that. We also have, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, box elder, but the willows. This site was so disturbed prior to the park being established that we're still working with it, even 15 years later. So we're still working with it and trying to manage a lot of these non-native species.
And Josh, can you tell us a little bit about the history? What was this before the park was established?
Yeah, so for many years, this was owned by Hallett's. The company Hallett's, and it was called Hallett's Quarry, and so they mined sand and gravel out of this for many, many years. But as in the late 60s and 70s, that slowed down. There was a proposal by a developer in the late 90s, early 2000s to purchase this property to make it a development area, and it would have been a great development area for some of those people. But a group of individuals came together and said, hey, we need to preserve this land. We need to restore it back to its native. And so that's what happened. The city of Ames passed a bond issue, and over 80% of the individuals that voted for it voted yes, which is unheard of in any type of bond issue in any type of community. So this has been a great effort put on by the Friends of Ada Hayden Heritage Park and multiple other individuals throughout the city to get this park established. And there's been continued efforts for many, many years to continue to keep this going, and we're going to keep it going and keep managing it the way it's supposed to be managed for as long as we can. So
all right, so Josh, one question I have, and I think this is a challenge for any land resource manager, is multiple use, right? Yeah. So there's lots of uses happening out here, and different factions of people will like Canada thistle, as you mentioned, because it provides seed for goldfinches, or they might find, the sandbar willow is great for a nice shrub thicket for birds to nest in or something. And so you could probably go down the list and talk about dragonflies and insects and others.
Yes.
So is that something that you try to factor into what you're trying to do here, or?
Yeah, and so like you said, we have multiple individuals that are that's the thing I've always noticed about the individuals that, I'm not from Ames, I'm from west of here, but the thing I've always noticed about the residents of Ames, everybody's very passionate about very many different things. And so specifically at this park, there's so many individuals that are passionate about very diverse types of plants and species. And so trying to not necessarily please those individuals, but try to manage all of that is a challenge for us. And so that does enter in or as a factor in how we manage this park. But obviously there's some things that are kind of we're not going to compromise on. Noxious weeds, we're doing our best to get rid of those. It's the law, specifically musk thistle. We have a group of individuals that have harvested over 1,000 flowers of musk thistle for many years, and if you go around the park, there's not a ton of musk thistle here. We have individuals that let us know about the Canada thistle, but trying to manage that as well, as you said, in regards to the birders wanting to keep that there as well. So we do not touch tall thistle typically in the fall, as you see it later in the summer. So I've talked about a lot of thistle species, but one of the things that we're trying to take care of is ensure that individuals still have a view of the lake.
Right.
When people are exercising or just enjoying their time out here.
And the goal of this buffer strip would have been just to provide sort of a prairie-like environment, right?
Yeah.
As just a buffer strip between the lake and the trail here.
Yeah, and so it's
with
every area or every this whole area is pretty heavily sloped. So we had to one of the unfortunate parts of managing the slope was it was seeded with native species, but in the seed bank or in the seed mix was crown vetch, and so we're fighting crown vetch right now. We're gonna hit it hard this fall, selectively, but that's been a challenge, and how crown vetch takes over everything. So that's one of the things that that we didn't have anything to do with, but it just comes in, and we're trying to manage that. So
right, yeah, the invasive species problem is always a big challenge, and yeah, the crown vetch, the Canada thistle. Those are two big ones, the canary grass. And each one of those species, of course, will probably require a different strategy, and so when you've got a mixture of them, that just makes things a lot harder.
Yeah, and then also communicating to the public, like, hey, we know it. We know some of these are issues, but also we have 37 other parks. We have a certain amount of money that we can spend at this in the park system, so we have to be able to manage those funds effectively. That's why the Friends of Ada Hayden Heritage Park have been such a great asset to our partnership with them, because they have provided some financial
some of the help.
Yeah, and have
money and
yeah, exactly, and
labor.
also exactly. So
Good.
they've been really helpful in this. Here we are on the west side of Ada Hayden Heritage Park. If you're familiar with Ames, this is right along Hyde Avenue, northwest part or straight north side of Ames. And what we're standing here in now is an area that was recently ceded to prairie in the summer of 2017. It was seeded with 55 different native prairie species. But prior to that, it was as a hayfield. It was clover, and we contracted with an individual, and he would come and hay it every summer. But there was an agreement with him that, hey, when we want to seed it to prairie, when the money was available, we would go ahead and seed it. So we went ahead and seeded with the help of Story County Conservation. Joe Quaker and his staff helped us seed it. But it's basically we mowed it a few times in that summer, and then also in 2018 we mowed it. But we haven't done a burn yet. As you can see, there's a lot of color right now, but we really need to burn it. We were going to try to burn it this last spring, but the weather was not necessarily conducive for that. I'm going to turn it over to Tom Rosburg, and he's going to give us a little more information about it.
All right, so yeah, as John said, you can see there's a lot of color out there. We can see a lot of the first wave of prairie species in the planting. There were some really successful species, the gray-headed coneflower, the bee balm, bergamot. I can see, but there are some later successful species too. I can see a compass plant off to the left over here a ways. So that's a good sign. Yeah, there's a lot of brome and bluegrass in here, so that's a residual effect from when it was a hayfield. I don't see too much clover, which is good, although there's actually some hay right here, alfalfa. So that's always a problem when you go from that kind of perennial herbaceous land cover type into a prairie. Josh, do you remember what was done to prepare this site? Did they use Roundup?
Yeah, so we hit it with Roundup twice, and we probably should have seeded it with like a cold pre-season, like a rye species. And we probably could have sprayed it the third time, but the clover was vicious. And after the first season or first 2 years, I was really discouraged. A lot of knotweed, knotweed and some other stuff had come up, and just pretty discouraging. But after the third year, it was actually starting to show color like this. So it gave me a little hope.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you did at least a couple applications, because usually when you're trying to get rid of the perennial herbaceous cover, clovers and bromes and Timothy grass and Kentucky bluegrass, those forage grasses, usually one application on doesn't work. So that's good at least. It's always probably some going to be in the seed bank, so spraying is never going to get that. So yeah, those burns, if you're able to get as late spring, I like to say early May roughly, if you could burn as fast as early May, that will go a long ways to helping to knock back the Kentucky bluegrass and the brome. And in some cases, with the competition that we have started here, it might really help knock it back quite a bit.
Hi, so we have moved from Ada Hayden Park to Brookside Park. Joining me is Liz Calhoun. She is an engineer in the Public Works Department with the City of Ames, and she's going to talk about the river restoration project.
Thanks, Pat. Yeah, we're here in Brookside Park and we're taking a look at our stream here. We have a river restoration project going on right now. We have a 40-foot high slope that is failing. It's all exposed and eroding away. We have a couple houses up above that, so we have put this project in the capital improvements plan. And the project will help to restore the waterway, stabilize and restore the slope. And then we have some water quality features as well. We have a new oxbow as part of this project. Our second concept resulted in actually decision to realign portions of the stream away from the steep slope. So we will incorporate an oxbow in the existing river channel, and that oxbow will help to provide some water quality from an existing storm sewer watershed that will come down from the east bank there. And so that's a great feature that we're going to add as an amenity. Primarily what we're doing here is pulling the slopes back and using natural stream bank stabilization techniques, enhancing the areas with native plants, trying to minimize as much as we can the hard armoring, but there will be a few areas that we'll have to use maybe some Fleximat or something like that where the slopes are too steep, but which we're making an attempt to do the natural solutions here. And so we'll have the oxbow, and then we'll also be narrowing the channel up in the upper reach, a little bit upstream of here. We'll be narrowing the channel, and right now it's widened out and there's a lot of meandering, so we'll be still keeping the sinuosity, but just trying to define the channel a little bit better and have some floodplain benches in a few areas to try to help to get the water to slow down and get up on those benches a little bit more. Yeah, so we're excited for this project. We've had some great public outreach meetings. We've had a series last summer where we heard back from the public, and they gave us some great feedback, and so we went back to the drawing board over the winter, and now we have a new preliminary plan that we're ironing out and be hopefully ready to go to construction this winter is our plan. So that's where we are right now.
Liz, question for you is, as far as the vegetation goes, what is the plan in terms of the establishment period and the long-term maintenance?
Yeah, we actually we're going to develop a plan, and we have Confluence landscape architects working with us on really trying to make a good and strong effort to get these areas established. So they're identifying the different zones for landscaping, and then we will develop a plan to manage that. We'll probably have we'll hire out a contractor the first few years is our plan on this area and some other areas around town, because that establishment period is so critical. So we recognize that'll be a challenge. Part of this site is going to be wooded, so that presents an issue as far as what we can get to grow there. So yeah, we're just gonna try to stay with it and manage it as best we can. So.
Okay. Were there any unique features, like any concerns about any fish species, sensitive fish species, or any bats that you had to work around?
So we will have to, actually, we don't know exactly the time frame yet. We're in the process of getting our permits, and we have a little bit of a contradiction because the rusty patch bumblebee is also been found in this area, and that's an federally endangered species. So for that species, construction generally they want the construction to be in the summer when the bees aren't nesting in the ground. However, so it's the opposite season for the bats. We want the construction to happen in the winter for the bats. The time to build and take trees down is better in the winter to help protect the bat habitat. So we're not sure which season will override. As we get our permits, we'll know more about that. So, okay, yeah. So here we have a steep slope. You can see we've got a fence put up here because the steep slope has been eroding away from the bank, and we have a path, a shared use path, probably about 5 feet from the top of the slope, and it might even be undermined a little bit. So you can see the need for having to regrade this slope, and actually the plan is to remove this particular path. There's been a new path built farther away from the creek, so we can grade this all out and get like 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 slope on this area, and also provide a lot more accessibility to the creek. Right now the public doesn't really see the creek except for at our bridges, and so we're trying to get much more engagement with the waterway. Okay, now we're up in part of our woodland area, kind of upstream from the creek project, but we do have a little area that we've identified as an area that we want to establish. Some of the trees have come down in the last few years with a path relocation project and the derecho that moved through, and so we have an area that's opened up to the sun, and so we'd like to plant some natives there that will like that area. The invasives have kind of dominated as the additional sunlight has come in, and so we're hoping to get a good plant palette figured out and get that area established, and it's right along our path, which the public uses a lot. So we're really excited about kind of educating people as they pass through here and getting that area to grow. I'm going to pass it over to Tom to.
Yeah. So we're looking at this area here. I don't know if you need the mic, maybe, huh?
So we have mic transfer going on here.
Yes, as Liz was saying, it's definitely got a weedy character to it here, especially with the burdock. There's a lot of burdock in here. That's something that will need to be removed. And even some of the native things like yellow wood sorrel right here. It's a native plant, but it's definitely a weedy species. Some of the goldenrods tend to be somewhat weedy. Well, this is giant goldenrod here. Some of the plants that would be examples of what would like to be here are native are the bellflower, tall bellflower. This is usually in a forest environment that's got a little more sun. And although forest is what we're standing in as a whole, because of the extra light along this trail right here, this is more of a woodland environment. So it's a good example of how a woodland environment can be a part of a larger forest because of the trail and the trees that have been removed to put the trail in. There is a lot more light here. And some other species that would be good to include. Here's an example of a native sedge that likes to be in floodplain forests and a woodland edge, perhaps. This is called Gray's sedge, Carex grayi. It's a pretty distinctive sedge, kind of nice look to it. A very cespitous or clump-forming sedge with these heads, flower heads. These are called perigynia, these large inflated sac-like structures. Each of these are perigynia that surround a fruit that was formed by, of course, the female flower that forms the fruit. Inside each of those is a fruit containing one seed. There's a plant a little bit further this way that apparently has been planted somehow. They've got here, planting it is how that happens. This one right here is everyone will recognize as purple coneflower, something that gets planted in a lot of gardens, and that's fine, but in an environment like this, it's not really appropriate because this is not native to Story County. This particular species of coneflower is, as far as we can tell, which is it's always difficult to be sure exactly what the native range was, of course, but based on the vouchers we've got and the records we've got, was native only to basically the southeastern, roughly maybe 1/5 of Iowa or so, from south central to southeast up into east central Iowa. This is a species of white vervain, which is a native species, and again, pretty much in the right environment, kind of woodland edge, woodland species, can grow also in more open grassland environments. But another example of a less conservative species that does also, to me, say this is kind of a disturbed area.
Tom, what about right behind you?
Oh, this grass right here, this is an excellent example of a grass species. This is bottlebrush grass that would be appropriate in an open woodland environment like this or savanna. So I don't know if it is something that was planted here. Has there been any planting going on here?
Not that I'm aware of.
Not yet, anyway. So it might be, again, a native population here that's responded to the light.
So Tom, in the city of Ames looking at, and the Friends of Brookside Park looking at establishing, wanting to invest in some native species in the woodland, do you have any suggestions, maybe not so much on specific species, but general species that they might consider?
I do, and I like to tell people that if you're planning to do a seeding, a planting, whether it's a prairie planting or a woodland planting, forest planting, whatever it might be, to me, the first important rule is make sure you choose species native to your county. So you ought to be trying to represent what was here. If you're trying to do a restoration should always be aimed at populations and systems that were here. So, and it's important for a lot of other reasons in terms of native species, because if you bring species in that are not native, you're moving them outside of their range, and you're kind of then putting them into an environment where they will have interactions with other species that they haven't evolved with. And so that's usually a recipe for disaster. That's basically what happens when invasive species become a problem. They've moved a lot farther, but they've moved outside of their native range into a new place, North America, for example, and left all of their species they evolved with behind, and now they're in an environment, in a situation where they don't have any species that naturally have evolved to control them. So that can happen even with native species to North America, moving them from one state to another, in a sense, or from southeast Iowa to northwest Iowa. It doesn't have to be halfway around the world. Just moving them outside of their native range puts them in an environment, again, where things aren't normal in a way. So that's always my first rule. Determine what species are native. Then, of course, of that list, determine which species are correct for the environment. What kind of soil, moisture regime are we talking about? Is it a hydric soil, a wet mesic soil, a mesic soil, a dry soil? Looking at the floodplain environment here, we would have a situation where we can have standing water here. So you have to take that into account. What kind of moisture or water environment is the site? And then the other part of that environment is the light. How much light are we talking about? Is it a closed environment, where there's a lot of forest cover, and so not much light? Or is it a prairie environment where there's a lot of light? Again, you have a gradient there from low to high. So you can kind of picture light and moisture as two factors on a two-dimensional graph in a sense, and figure out where you are in that two-dimensional space. That will then identify which species they're native and they fit the environment, and they fit the moisture and the light environment. Those are the correct species, and it's a matter of how many of those can you afford and what that list looks like.
I have a question. So, as far as the county species, is there a database available, or how do we find out what's native to our county?
That's a very important question. I'm glad you asked, because I should talk about that. It's not always real easy to do that. Now, for prairie species, there is a good resource. It's called Prairie Plants of Iowa. Paul Christensen and Mark Mueller were co-authors of that book. It's available at University of Iowa Press. It's actually available online through University of Iowa, so you can actually see it online in a sense and see the map. The important thing about that book is that Paul Christensen endeavored to represent the native range of species by showing a map of Iowa with all the counties and putting dots in places where vouchers, known collections were seen, were observed. He went through the herbaria records at Iowa State, UNI, U of I think at the time. Of course, herbaria was still down there at that time, and looked at vouchers and tried to, again, by looking at vouchers that have been collected prior to, say, roughly 1960, I suppose. That's roughly the date I would probably use if I were doing it. You can be pretty certain that you're looking at a native population, because plants weren't being moved and planted very much before 1960. So if you see a plant collected in 1955 or something like that, that's a plant that has always been growing there in a sense. Now that's not always true, because plants have been moved around so much, and so if you have a plant that's has a voucher and a record of 2015, well, maybe it's native, but maybe someone moved it there too and put it there, so it's not so clear. So again, that resource is available for prairie plants. Has about 150 prairie plants in it, so it's really good. Now, for forest or woodland plants, that kind of resource doesn't exist, unfortunately. And so I again tell people, as because I am so dedicated, I guess, to getting things right in terms of the native biogeography, I will help anyone who needs some help in determining what species are native. There are some other resources that I have available that aren't easy to direct people to, so that's probably the best way to approach it. I mean, you can go out and look at forests, and I guess I get some idea of things that are, but there's always going to be some questions, I think, for some species.
Okay, now we're farther upstream. We're at a northern pedestrian bridge here on the Iowa Creek, and you can see that we have a very wide channel here. We're planning to narrow this channel, at least the outsides down, so that we have kind of a more defined waterway and floodway. We'll be filling in on the opposite side here, and then reworking the thowweg coming into this bridge, vegetating it, and hopefully not taking down too many trees to do it, because our plan is to work in the channel and just move the material around within the channel. Okay, now we're over in the area where our oxbow will be. This is the existing stream, which will be relocated to the west. And so we have a pipe outflow just across the stream here, which will discharge into the oxbow, providing water quality. And then just downstream of here is our steep slope. It's partially viewable right now, but there's about a 40-foot high slope that's steeper than a 1-to-1 in many places. So that's what we will be pulling the stream away from.